So in Chapter 8, we're going to cover photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is not a metabolic process that happens in all cells, but it is the process that captures the sunlight and converts that energy, transforms that kinetic energy of sunlight into the potential energy in organic compounds in covalent bonds. And we'll use glucose as our example. And so it is important for the producers in the ecosystem, the plants and the other organisms that are able to do photosynthesis. And so for that reason, we're going to cover this metabolic process. But you'll remember that cellular respiration is something that's common to all organisms. Photosynthesis is important, but only found in the producers, in the plants and other photosynthetic organisms. So here's our overview. And you had some statements from your preview quiz that you remember. The sunlight is going to be the energy, and it's going to help the plant synthesize organic compounds such as glucose from inorganic carbon dioxide, which is CO2. Photosynthesis across the biosphere only captures about 1% of the radiation that comes to the Earth, and yet that is all the energy that is available to living systems. Primarily, the photosynthesis takes place in the leaves, sometimes the stems of land plants. There are also algae, which are not considered plants, but they are close relatives of plants. So in the ocean, you have algae that are able to do photosynthesis. And the particular organelle involved in photosynthesis is called the chloroplast. So plant cells have chloroplasts, algae have chloroplasts, if they are green algae anyway. And at the bottom here, we have a summary equation. We had a summary equation, you'll recall, in Chapter 7 for our cellular respiration. And here we have a summary equation for photosynthesis. On the reactant side, we have carbon dioxide, because we said carbon dioxide is going to be an important reactant. And we also have water. I'll explain what the water is doing. And then what's not on this summary equation, but needs to be, is the sunlight. The sunlight is providing the energy. So I'm going to add sunlight, and you should add that in your notes. Sometimes people put sunlight over the arrow, which is fine, but I'm going to put it as on the reactant side. And then on the product side, we're using glucose. C6H12O6 represents our organic compound that's being produced. Other organic compounds can be produced. And then we have some water here. So water is not only a reactant, but also a product. And then oxygen. We don't focus on the water here as a product so much, but we do focus on the sugar, the organic compound, and then the oxygen is really more of a byproduct. And by that I mean it's not particularly the intention of the plant, or the intention or the point of photosynthesis to make oxygen, but it is made in the process. So the point of photosynthesis, and if you had to give kind of a one-sentence summary of photosynthesis, it is the metabolic process by which sunlight is captured and converted and transformed into the bonds of glucose. And so we have some other participants in that process, but it's the transfer of energy and the transformation of energy from sunlight, which is a kinetic energy, into the bonds of glucose, which is a potential energy. So that's the main important part of photosynthesis. And then these other molecules are also helping. So we're going to start with a little bit of leaf anatomy. So like anything, a leaf has parts. And particularly we're looking at, if we look at a leaf here, if we zoom in, let me get my pen. If we zoom in on this leaf close up and then take a slice through the leaf, that's what you're looking at here, a little slice through a little section of the leaf. Most leaves aren't very thick, just a few layers of cells, and they have an epidermis, which we use that word even in animals. It's like the outer surface layer. But then inside the leaf, there is something called mesophyll. And mesophyll is where you have a lot of those photosynthetic cells. The epidermal cells have chloroplasts as well. But inside the leaf is where you have these cells. And the cells are not packed so tightly together. There is some space in between the cells where the gases from the outside environment are allowed in, and they move around in those spaces around the cells. And there are little pores on the underside of a leaf that can open and close, and those are called stoma. And the stoma can open to let gas come into those spaces inside the leaf, but outside of the cells, or to allow the gases to leave the leaf. And so there's an interesting anatomy to a leaf. But then we very quickly look at an individual cell, and this looks familiar to you because we identified in the past, we looked at the nucleus and the endoplasmic reticulum and the vacuole, the central vacuole, and the cell wall. But now we're going to take a closer look at the chloroplast. And so step by step, they're kind of zooming in until we see this chloroplast up close and on the right side of your screen. Like the mitochondrion, the chloroplast has more than one membrane and more than one space. In fact, the chloroplast has 3 membranes and 3 spaces that have names and that we're going to learn. And so the outer membrane, just like in the mitochondrion, it's just a nice smooth outer membrane. It's called the outer membrane. And then inside of that, there's another membrane. It's called the inner membrane. But this inner membrane is not folded like it was in the mitochondrial inner membrane. This is another smooth membrane. But inside of that membrane, there's a third, group of membranes. And we call it the third membrane is called the thylakoid membrane. But the thylakoids are arranged in small discs. So we just call them the thylakoid membranes, but they're actually arranged in these disc shapes. And on the inside of the thylakoid disc is a liquid center, an aqueous solution inside of the disc. So we have the outer membrane, we have the inner membrane, and then we have these thylakoid membranes, and each thylakoid membrane disc has a center space, and the center space is called the thylakoid space. Outside of the thylakoid membrane, but inside the inner membrane, is another space called the stroma. So in this chapter, the spaces and membranes that are going to be important are going to be the thylakoid membrane, the thylakoid space or thylakoid lumen, shown in red. It's not really red. And then the stroma is the space outside of the thylakoid. And so those locations become important as we talk about the process of photosynthesis. So the chloroplast is a photosynthetic machine. It has all these membranes, these thylakoid membranes, which the membranes contain chlorophyll molecules inserted into the membrane. Very much like, remember, proteins can cross membranes or can be inserted into membranes. We call those transmembrane proteins. Chlorophyll is not a protein, but it's inserted into the membrane in the same way. And any other pigments are also inserted into the thylakoid membranes. So when we look at this picture here, the artist has done a few things that I don't care for. And it's hard, I guess, if you're an artist to make choices. But really, the outer membrane and the inner membrane have no color at all. They are colorless. But the thylakoids, that's where the chlorophyll and other pigment molecules are. So those membranes have a color. They're green. Anyway, all right. So in the thylakoid membrane, you will have these pigments. these chlorophyll and other pigments inserted into the membranes. And you have these clusters, like groupings of pigment molecules in certain areas of the membrane, and we call that a photosystem. So a photosystem is going to have a particular meaning, a particular structure that we're going to talk about, but fundamentally there's a group of pigment molecules in a grouping on a section of the thylakoid membrane, and then you have another photosystem over here and another one over here. So all over the thylakoid membranes you have these clusters of pigment molecules that form these many photosystems. And as I said, the stroma is the liquid the space outside of the thylakoid, but still inside the inner membrane of the chloroplast. And the stroma is going to contain enzymes for part of the photosynthesis process that we're going to go over. All right. So the good news is that photosynthesis only has two phases or two stages. The first one is typically called the light-dependent reactions, or sometimes we just say light reactions. The second phase or stage is called the Calvin cycle. It also goes by a few other names that you should write down. Sometimes we call it the light-independent reactions, which is, I think, was on your preview vocabulary list. So Calvin cycle and light-independent reactions mean the same thing. And so what we're looking at here are the first stage requires light, so it's light-dependent. It can't happen if there's no light. The second stage, the Calvin cycle, is light independent. It doesn't require light. It can happen in light, but it doesn't need the light. And so for that reason, not only do we call it the light independent reactions, but some scientists call it the dark reactions. Not because it has to happen in the dark, but it could happen in the dark. The light reactions have to happen in light. And so these are your two phases or your two stages of photosynthesis. And the first stage, I'm going to go to the next slide because it gives a spatial separation of the two stages. So this is the thylakoid disc. You're seeing part of a thylakoid disc here in this picture. Let me get my laser pointer. Okay, so here's your thylakoid disc, or one part of it. And they show it green. That's accurate. That's where the pigments would be in this membrane here. And so the light-dependent reactions are actually happening at the thylakoid membrane. So that's why they wrote that right there. The Calvin cycle, though, is happening in the stroma. Right? And so that's your spatial separation or spatial layout of the reactions of photosynthesis. And what the light-dependent reactions do is they involve the pigment molecules, those photosystems, capturing light from the sunlight and then transferring it and transforming it into two product molecules. One is ATP and one is NADPH. Now, ATP doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from ADP plus phosphate, PI, inorganic phosphate. ADP plus phosphate yields ATP, synthesis of ATP. And then the synthesis of NADPH, it comes from NADP plus picking up electrons to become NADPH. NADP plus is just like NAD plus from respiration. There's just an extra phosphate in that molecule than what's in the mitochondria. So NADP plus is also an electron carrier. When it picks up electrons, it becomes NADPH. And so what you have here is during the light-dependent reactions, sunlight, and I'm going to go into a little more detail in a minute, but sunlight comes in. Remember, it's on the reactant side, and it gets converted or it gets transformed into the bonds of ATP. And it also energizes some electrons, which get picked up by NADPH. So those are your products of, some of your products of the light-dependent reactions. And the real reason that you need to make ATP and NADPH here is so that the Calvin cycle has energy and electrons that it can get. And what happens in the Calvin cycle is the process that takes in carbon dioxide and connects those carbon dioxides together into organic molecules like glucose. And so in the process of the Calvin cycle, the ATP, which was generated by the light-dependent reactions, is then broken down into ADP. And the NADPH, which was made by the light-dependent reactions, is oxidized to NADP+. So the Calvin cycle needs the ATP and the NADP+ to convert or to build organic molecules from CO2. And when you build molecules, it requires energy. So the Calvin cycle requires energy, and that energy is coming from the ATP and the NADPH that was made during the light-dependent reactions. And the light-dependent reactions is getting its energy from the sun. All right, so that's an overview and also gives us a little bit of that spatial explanation of where this is happening in the chloroplast. Okay, let's talk a little bit about energy again. Light is a form of energy. We said it's a kinetic form of energy. And light has the properties of both waves and particles. So the wave nature of light produces what we call an electromagnetic spectrum. And I'll show you on the next slide what that looks like. But it's when energy travels in waves, you can't see the waves with your eye, but it has a frequency, meaning it goes up and down. That's why they're called waves. And at the top of a wave and at the top of the next wave, if you measure the distance between waves, and you can't do it without a tool, but if you can measure the distance between the waves, it's called the wavelength. So different types of light have different wavelengths, some of which your eye can detect as colors, but there's actually a lot of light that you can't see because your eye doesn't sense it. But in the universe, there's a lot of wavelengths that are there. And so visible light is really only part of the whole, all the waves that are surrounding you all the time. And so that's the concept is that light travels in these waves, and every kind of wave has a certain wavelength. It turns out that energy that has a very short wavelength is very penetrating. It can go through your body in some cases. And energy that has very long wavelengths tends to have much lower energy and it can't penetrate. So the visible light, though, is mainly all we're going to be worrying about in this section of the course. And so I will show you that part of it. And you may be aware that you can separate visible light into its separate wavelengths into what your eye would detect as colors with the use of a prism. All right. Now, so we said light can be considered as a wave, but we also consider light to have a certain aspect of it that is more like a particle, almost like a piece of matter in a way, a particle of light. It has some properties that make it feel like it's a particle. And when we think about light as a particle, we use this word photon. So we kind of have to keep this dual nature of light in sort of tension in our mind. We have to always, think. Sometimes you'll be directed to think of it more as a wave. Sometimes you'll be directed to think of it more as a photon. But either way, these are two ways that we think of as light. So a photon is a particle of light, or sometimes we call it a bundle of energy. So it's like a little packet. Sometimes they say a packet of energy, if you can imagine that. Okay, so in this diagram, here's the entire electromagnetic spectrum, all the different waves that are around you all the time. Gamma rays, X-rays, UV. And then right here in this little section, there's the visible light waves. And your eye detects them as color, so they've depicted that as color. And then infrared and radio waves. And so what happens is, as you look at these wavelengths, Very tiny wavelengths, that means that the waves are very close together. Those are very high energy, very penetrating, and actually very damaging to living cells. These really long wavelengths, 100 meters between the tops of the waves, those are really long waves. Those are not as penetrating, not dangerous. So those are on this end of the spectrum. So your visible light's in the middle. Visible light is not harmful to cells, but UV is. So anything on this side is damaging to cells. UV is damaging, X-rays are damaging, gamma rays are damaging. Anything on this side tends to not be damaging. But anyway, visible light, they expanded this section and we can see all these colors here. So each color has kind of a certain wavelength or maybe a range of wavelengths that it has. And then when that wavelength hits your eye, what your brain interprets it as a color. Okay. And so when photons hit something, if you think of packets of energy coming and hitting a leaf from the sun, these little things, these particles hitting the sun, hitting a leaf from the sun, what happens is the photon can transfer its energy to something in the leaf. And it's actually going to transfer its energy to an electron that's in the leaf. In fact, it's going to transfer its energy to an electron that's in one of those pigment molecules that's in the leaf, in the thylakoid membrane of the cells of the leaf. And so here at the bottom, I give you kind of the summary here. Pigments absorb sunlight or take the energy from photons, and the energy is transferred to the pigment's own electrons. But then what happens, and you're kind of used to this concept because we've already covered chapter 7, those electrons then are passed to something else. So the light energizes some of the electrons that are in the pigment, and then those electrons are going to be passed to something else. All right. Let's talk about pigments before we talk about where those electrons are passed to. There are many different types of pigments in plants. Not all of them are photosynthetic. They all can absorb energy from the sun and wavelengths from the sun. But the two in green plants that are the most important, well, not the only two, but the two that are the main ones are called chlorophylls and carotenoids or carotenes. And the chlorophylls tend to have a green color. They do have a green color, and the carotenoids have a yellowish orange typically. But there are other pigments, and there are other photosynthetic pigments. There are some that are very yellow. A red algae has a red pigment that is photosynthetic, and a brown algae has a combination of pigments that make it look brown. But we're going to just stick to these as our beginning, as we talk about these things in the beginning. All right. So chlorophylls and carotenoids. All right. So when a photon strikes a pigment molecule, and these pigments are in the thylakoid membrane, the energy is either lost as heat, converted to heat. Remember, heat is a wasted form of energy, or absorbed by electrons in that molecule. So when we're talking about photosynthesis, what we're going to be talking about is the photon is going to hit a pigment molecule, and some of the electrons in the pigment molecule will absorb or get the energy from that photon. So you can say that the photon transfers its energy to those electrons, or you can say the electrons absorb the energy of the photon. There's a lot of ways to say it. And what's going to happen is the electrons are going to move from whatever energy level they're in up into a higher energy level in that atom. Because remember, the electrons are actually part of an atom. Right? Now, to be absorbed, the amount of energy in the photon has to match the amount of energy needed to move that electron to a higher energy level, which is just a fancy way of saying that each molecule can only absorb a very particular wavelength of light. And we call that the absorption spectrum. The wavelength of light that it can be absorbed by a particular pigment. So when you look at chlorophyll, and this is actually, they have the carotenoids and two types of chlorophyll graphed here. What you have on the x-axis are the colors, right? The wavelengths of the light. And your eye would perceive purple, which is a 400 nanometer wavelength type of light. Blue is 450 to 500. Green is 550. You can see 600 gets you into orange. 650, 700 is red. You don't have to memorize those. So, but each wavelength is perceived as a certain color by your eye, so that's why they put the colors there. Now, pigments that absorb these wavelengths, for example, the carotenoids, the chlorophylls, what they're showing in this graph is where each pigment has a high level of absorption of that light. So I'm going to put my pointer right here. So this is chlorophyll A. Chlorophyll A seems to have a peak of absorbance in, I don't know, maybe 425 nanometer range. So that wavelength of light really is really absorbed by chlorophyll A. Chlorophyll B and the carotenoids have peaks over here, but ultimately when you have all these pigments in the same leaf, you get a lot of absorption in this range. You also get a fair amount of absorption in this range, but what you'll notice is none of the pigments absorb very well in this range. And so it turns out the pigments are absorbing these wavelengths, and the ones that are not absorbed, that's the color that comes back to your eye. When you're looking at a leaf, you see it as green. That's because those wavelengths are not absorbed by the leaf. And they're bouncing back and hitting you in the eye. I guess you can think of it that way. They're reflected back and they hit you and you see green. So green is the color, or green is the wavelength of light that is not used by chlorophyll or carotenoids, which I think is kind of funny because I think if you asked anybody who didn't know much biology, what color of light do plants use or absorb and use for photosynthesis, most people would probably say green. But in fact, green is the color that's not used. It's the color that hits the leaf and bounces back and does not get absorbed. So chlorophylls preferentially absorb on the violet blue and on the red orange side, but they reflect those photons that have wavelengths around 500 to 600 nanometers, so that hits our eye and we see green. And you do not need to know the two types of chlorophylls in any detail, but just as a side note, chlorophyll A is one of your main chlorophylls. And chlorophyll B is considered an accessory or secondary pigment, and it picks up some of additional wavelengths that chlorophyll A doesn't pick up. The structure of both chlorophylls is very similar. There is a fairly large structure composed of carbons and hydrogens. And remember, anytime you have two lines that come together and there's no letter there, that's a carbon. So all these intersections of lines represent carbons, and then there's some nitrogen. In the middle, there's a magnesium. But you have this kind of fairly large structure. It almost looks to me like a little honeycomb, or a little honeycomb, I think is a good name. But it's an organic molecule. It's not a honeycomb, but it has that shape. So this is a molecule, and this part of the molecule is called the porphyrin head. This is the part that absorbs the photon of light's energy. But attached to the head is a tail, and it's a hydrocarbon, very much like a fatty acid tail, but there's only one tail. So this isn't a phospholipid, but it sure has some characteristics like a phospholipid in that it has a head and it has a tail, just one. And so that tail is going to be what is inserted into the phospholipid bilayer, and the head lays on the surface of the membrane. And you have hundreds of these chlorophylls, thousands of these chlorophylls spread out all over those thylakoid membranes. Okay, I'm going to take a break and then we're going to, in the next lecture segment, we'll talk about photosystems.